Evelyn approached the club with the same warm anticipation she always felt when visiting a cherished space. Tonight was special. It was her birthday, and she looked forward to celebrating with the familiarity and joy this place had always brought her. But what should have been a celebration would soon spiral into an encounter that no one in the room would forget. When Evelyn neared the door, she expected smiles and an easy entry. Instead, she was met with cold stares and hostility from a young doorman who had no idea he was speaking to the mother of the club's owner. He denied her entry, a decision that would not only unravel his career in a matter of moments, but also ignite a conversation far bigger than he could have imagined. What happened next would leave every patron in the room stunned. But to understand, we need to start from the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Your voice helps bring awareness to systemic injustice and empowers change. Evelyn walked slowly toward the entrance of the club. Over the years, this vibrant venue had become more than just a destination. It was a place of connection, laughter, and memories. Sometimes she came with family, other times with friends, and occasionally alone. Tonight, though, it was just her, a celebration she had carefully planned for herself. The faint hum of music and the lively murmur of voices reached her before she opened the door. The club's energy felt as inviting as ever. She adjusted her coat and smoothed her dress, ready for a night of happiness. As she stepped forward, her eyes met the doorman's. He was young, sharp-looking, and slightly frowning, as if irritated by something. Evelyn paid little attention, assuming he was simply tired from the evening rush. She approached him with her usual warmth and politeness. "Hello," she said, her voice kind but confident. "I have a reservation under the name Evelyn." The doorman barely looked at her before glancing down at his clipboard. There was a flicker of something in his expression, something that made Evelyn's chest tighten with unease. Finally, without meeting her gaze, he said curtly, "There's no reservation under that name. We're full tonight." Her heart sank slightly. Evelyn frowned, unsure how to respond. Could this be a simple mistake? Or was there something else at play here? What Evelyn didn't yet realize was that this moment would mark the beginning of an evening that would not only change her, but ripple far beyond the club's walls. Evelyn frowned, trying to make sense of the doorman's refusal. She had called the day before to confirm her reservation, so how could there be no record of it? Her voice remained calm but carried a note of disbelief. "But I called yesterday and confirmed my reservation. Could there have been a mistake?" The doorman sighed impatiently, his irritation apparent. "I said there's no reservation under that name, and we're at capacity. You'll need to try somewhere else." The dismissive tone, the cold response, it wasn't new to Evelyn. She felt her heart tighten, the familiar sting of being treated as if she didn't belong. This wasn't just about a reservation. The look in his eyes and his clipped tone were unmistakable reminders of a lifetime of prejudice. This wasn't the first time she had been met with this kind of hostility. She had seen it in shops, schools, and offices. Anywhere someone like her was judged by the surface and deemed unworthy. Evelyn's mind swirled with memories of these moments as her unease gave way to something deeper. Recognition. But Evelyn wasn't one to back down easily. She steadied herself, drawing on her lifetime of quiet resilience. She softened her voice, hoping reason might still prevail. "Are you sure there's no place for me? I could wait by the counter. I don't mind waiting if that helps." The doorman didn't even try to hide his smirk this time. He crossed his arms, his gaze condescending as he replied, "I've said all I can. There are no available tables, and that's not up for discussion." As he stood there, his stance defiant and his tone final, Evelyn felt the weight of his dismissal growing heavier. But there was something else stirring now, a quiet determination. This moment wasn't just about her birthday or a reservation. It was about something much larger. Evelyn felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her. The quiet murmurs of diners had dulled, their attention now fixed on the woman at the door and the confrontation unfolding. She had always hated being the center of attention, especially in moments like these. But tonight was different. She wasn't just any customer. She was the mother of the club's owner. And though she never wanted to use that status as leverage, this moment demanded more than silence. Evelyn stood tall, suppressing the anger and disappointment brewing inside her. "Perhaps you don't know who I am," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. The doorman leaned against the doorframe, his disdain growing more apparent with every passing second. "I don't care who you are," he replied with a sneer. "There's no place for people like you here." His words struck like lightning, jolting Evelyn with their venom. For a moment she stood frozen, shocked by the open hostility of his tone. Could prejudice still thrive so openly, even in a place built by her own family? The bitterness of the moment was undeniable, but it also stirred something familiar inside her, the need to fight back. Evelyn's heart pounded as she processed the exchange. Memories of a lifetime of injustices flooded her mind. She thought of all the times she had been dismissed, ignored, or humiliated simply because of her appearance. But she wasn't that young girl anymore, easily silenced by the world's unfairness. Though years of battling prejudice had left her weary, Evelyn knew what was at stake. To walk away now would mean giving in, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. Her pulse steadied as her resolve grew. Straightening her shoulders, she stood firm. She didn't know how this would end, but one thing was clear. She wasn't leaving without standing her ground. The doorman, emboldened by Evelyn's momentary silence, smirked wider, his confidence growing as if her hesitance had validated his actions. His tone turned sharper, his words dripping with disdain. "Do you think you're allowed here just because you've come before? You don't belong in places like this anymore," he said coldly, his gaze flicking dismissively to her worn purse and modest shoes. "Go back to where you came from." The words cut deep, but Evelyn refused to let them break her. She straightened her back, finding strength in the memories of her struggles and victories. This wasn't the first time she had faced such disdain, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But tonight, she couldn't let this moment pass unchallenged. Evelyn thought of her son, James, the countless times she had fought for him, standing by his side when he was unfairly judged, stopped, or denied opportunities simply for being a young black man. She had taught him to hold his head high, to persevere despite a world that often refused to see his worth. Now her own lessons echoed back to her. She couldn't allow herself to remain silent. Around her, the room began to shift. Murmurs rippled among the diners as heads turned toward the unfolding confrontation. Some patrons pulled out their phones, quietly recording the exchange. Within moments, the scene was being shared online. Posts accompanied by captions and hashtags condemning what was now impossible to ignore. Evelyn glanced briefly at the onlookers. Their attention only deepened her resolve. She knew walking away would leave her with a bitter sense of defeat, a feeling she had fought too hard to overcome in her life. No, not this time. Taking a steadying breath, Evelyn raised her hand in a quiet but commanding gesture. "I would like to speak to the manager," she said firmly, her calm tone edged with steel. The room grew quieter as her words hung in the air, charged with anticipation. All eyes were now on her, and the weight of the moment was undeniable. The doorman hadn't anticipated this turn of events. His smirk faltered and his confidence wavered as Evelyn's steady composure unsettled him. He gave her one last glance, dismissing her as someone whose words would amount to nothing. Still, her demand for the manager was clear and impossible to ignore. Without another word, he turned abruptly and disappeared behind the counter to summon his superior. Evelyn remained rooted in place, her posture firm and unyielding. Her thoughts swirled as she tried to steady herself. Around her, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers floated from nearby tables as more patrons took notice of what was happening. The energy in the room was no longer one of casual dining, but of intrigue and silent judgment. Meanwhile, the digital world was already stirring. Phones captured every moment, and within minutes, videos of Evelyn's confrontation were making their way onto social media. Hashtags decrying discrimination began trending, amplifying her fight far beyond the walls of the restaurant. Unbeknownst to Evelyn, her stand had become a public affair. Her fight for justice was no longer hers alone. It had become a shared moment of collective reckoning. Despite her exhaustion, she felt a small surge of satisfaction. Perhaps this was exactly what needed to happen. A few minutes later, the manager emerged from the back, his steps hurried and his face pale. He had already received several notifications and messages about the growing commotion and the attention it was drawing online. Clearly, the situation was spiraling far beyond his control. When his eyes met Evelyn's, recognition dawned immediately. His expression shifted as he realized who she was. Mrs. Evelyn, the mother of James, the club's owner. Mrs. Evelyn, he said quickly, his voice layered with nervousness in an attempt at calm. I apologize for the misunderstanding. Let me personally help you find a table. But Evelyn's calm, steady gaze made it clear that she wasn't just looking for a resolution. This moment wasn't about getting a table. It was about something far more significant. Evelyn met the manager's nervous apology with a steady, unyielding gaze. She could have let him resolve the issue right then and there, accepting his offer to find her a table and putting the moment behind her. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't fix the problem. This wasn't just about one rude doorman or one instance of prejudice. It was about something far more entrenched, the systemic bias that had managed to seep even into places she once believed were safe. Her voice was calm but carried undeniable strength as she spoke. You don't need to apologize only to me, she said firmly, her eyes sweeping across the room, ensuring everyone could hear her words. You need to apologize to everyone who has faced similar discrimination. This isn't just an incident. It's part of a larger problem, and it needs to be addressed. The manager hesitated, his face reddening under the weight of her words. He could feel the stares of patrons pressing down on him, hear the quiet clicks of phones capturing every second of this moment. The knowledge that this confrontation was already spreading online filled him with unease. If he didn't act decisively, the consequences could go far beyond a single dissatisfied customer. Meanwhile, James was rushing to the restaurant, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. His phone had been flooded with alerts, links to videos, and messages from friends and colleagues. Seeing the footage had ignited a mix of anger and disappointment. How could such an incident happen in the establishment he had worked so hard to build? A place meant to symbolize inclusion, respect, and hospitality had now become the epicenter of a very public confrontation. As Evelyn stood her ground, the manager finally stammered, You're absolutely right, Mrs. Evelyn. This is not acceptable. We will take steps to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. But his words felt hollow, and Evelyn wasn't done yet. The atmosphere inside the restaurant shifted the moment James walked through the doors. His strides were deliberate, his expression cold and resolute. The murmurs of the diners quieted as their attention turned to the man who now stood at the center of the unfolding drama. James's eyes locked on his mother, standing firm despite the exhaustion etched on her face. Next to her stood the visibly uncomfortable manager and the now pale-faced doorman, who seemed to shrink under James' piercing gaze. The tension in the room thickened, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. What's going on here? James asked, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs with precision. The doorman's face twisted with realization as it dawned on him who James was. He stammered, his confidence evaporating under the intensity of James' presence. James didn't wait for an explanation. His gaze shifted to the manager, sharp and unrelenting. Why is my mother standing here, forced to endure this humiliation? I opened this restaurant to ensure that everyone, regardless of who they are, feels welcome here. And instead, this is what she faces? The manager fumbled for words, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to form an excuse. But James raised a hand to silence him. There was no room for excuses. Turning back to the doorman, James delivered his judgment with unwavering authority. You're fired! Leave the restaurant immediately! The doorman's face flushed red as the weight of James's words sank in. He didn't argue. Lowering his head, he turned and walked out, his steps heavy with the realization that his prejudice had cost him his job. The room remained silent for a moment, tension lingering like a held breath. Then a ripple of applause broke through, growing into a wave of support. The diners clapped and cheered, their approval echoing throughout the restaurant. Evelyn stood quietly, pride swelling in her chest as she watched her son command the room. The community's support was unmistakable, and in that moment, she knew this fight wasn't in vain. Loop. With the doorman gone, readers are left anticipating how James will use this moment to address the diners and staff, taking the fight for justice to the next level. As the doorman walked out of the restaurant, the weight of justice served hung in the air. The patrons, phones in hand, continued to record every moment, capturing not just the firing, but also the strength and resolve James had shown. Within minutes, the footage began spreading online, the hashtags growing louder. #Stand Against Bias, #Justice in Action. What had started as a confrontation in a single restaurant now rippled outward, touching a much larger audience. This moment wasn't just about Evelyn, James, or the restaurant. It was about a societal reckoning. Conversations on systemic prejudice and accountability began flooding social media. The incident became a rallying cry, a stark example of how personal courage could spark broader change. James turned to the diners and staff, his expression calm but resolute. "My mother should never have had to go through this. No one should. This is a place where everyone, regardless of race, background, or status, is welcome. We will work tirelessly to ensure that something like this never happens again." The room erupted into applause. The clapping grew louder, echoing through the walls, accompanied by cheers of approval. The unity of the crowd was unmistakable, a moment of collective acknowledgement that prejudice would not go unchecked. Evelyn stood quietly beside her son, her heart swelling with pride. She had always believed in James, but seeing him take control of the situation and use it to create a platform for change reminded her of why she had fought so hard for him throughout his life. Though tired from the night's events, Evelyn felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was no longer just about her birthday. It had become a statement, a symbol of resilience, and the power of standing up for what is right. As the applause died down, Evelyn glanced around the room. She could see the shift in the atmosphere. What had started as a tense and hostile evening had transformed into a moment of unity, understanding, and determination to do better. As the applause faded and the tension in the room dissipated, the atmosphere in the restaurant gradually shifted. Conversations resumed, but the energy was different. There was a collective understanding that something significant had just unfolded. An injustice had been confronted, and a message of unity and accountability had been delivered. James, still standing next to his mother, addressed the room one final time. His voice carried a mix of authority and sincerity, commanding the attention of everyone present. "Thank you all for your support," he began. "This restaurant is a place for everyone, regardless of race or background. We will ensure that what happened tonight doesn't happen again. Change starts with us, and we are committed to making that change." His words were met with another wave of applause. The cheers carried a sense of solidarity, a reminder to both James and Evelyn that the fight for equality never truly ends. Social media continued buzzing with activity, the story spreading across platforms and reaching an audience far beyond the restaurant's walls. The videos and posts sparked discussions in comments, forums, and news outlets, amplifying the incident into a broader dialogue about systemic injustice. Evelyn looked at her son with pride. What had started as a painful encounter had transformed into something far more meaningful. This day had become a celebration of resilience, community, and the ability to turn even the smallest act of defiance into a symbol of change. Later that evening, as the restaurant emptied and the hum of activity subsided, Evelyn and James sat together at a quiet table. The weight of the day still lingered, but so did its triumphs. "This was more than I ever expected, James," Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and pride. James nodded, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You've always taught me to fight for what's right, Mom. That's what tonight was about. But this is just the beginning." Together, they reflected on the events that had unfolded. James outlined his plans to implement new training programs for the staff, ensuring that prejudice and bias would have no place in his restaurant. He spoke of initiatives to promote tolerance and equality, determined to make his establishment a beacon of inclusion. For Evelyn, this day had marked not only her birthday, but also a milestone in her lifelong fight against prejudice. Their struggle had become an inspiration to many, a testament to the power of resilience, community, and justice. As the night drew to a close, mother and son sat side by side, knowing that their shared resolve would carry forward into every day that followed.